Above the Law, a trauma-informed, appreciative approach to examining mayoral control of New York City public schools. I will now continue with Cycle 1, Stage 1 of the Appreciative Informed Resonant Transformation by disclosing my traumatic narrative as it relates to the Governance Goal Engagement Part 3, Personal Management of Mobbing Part 2. The Bungled Scheme. The bungled scheme had four main characters: Dr. Worse, Mr. Impulse, Miss Evil, and Miss Minnie. Dr. Worse served as the head of the department but worked closely with Miss Evil, the actual department head in reality, but not by perception. Miss Minnie collaborated with Dr. Worse on projects, was a secondary department head, and was Miss Evil's protege. Dr. Worse also worked closely with Mr. Impulse, a consultant who ensured collaborations with New York City public schools on behalf of the organization. Dr. Worse repeated the same rule regarding that man: no one speaks to Mr. Impulse. Ever. Any messages to Mr. Impulse must go through Dr. Worse. Dr. Worse even wrote about this regulation in the department policies. Strategically developed situations of sabotage led to frequent phone and Zoom meetings with all supervisors. Miss Minnie and I would call each other for guidance on essential tasks. I would meet with Miss Evil and Miss Minnie over Zoom. Dr. Worse called under the pretense of serving as a mentor, which I requested and she agreed. Remember, Dr. Worse hired me. Please remember this important fact. She would keep me on the phone for hours. I discussed my understanding of executing each task, and she demanded that I run all final decisions, including mass communications, through her before execution. I would question ambiguous job expectations, the mobbing that I was experiencing, and discuss my mental health. And she, in turn, would discuss organizational norms. And that's when the butterflies that I felt undertaking the position turned into red flags. You see, the main idea of Dr. Worse's many stories was that I was experiencing mobbing because I was a black woman. According to Dr. Worse, mobbing existed as an organizational norm for black employees that I would just have to get accustomed to. So, when yet another situation of sabotage led me to defend myself via policy, Dr. Worse called me again. When discussing the situation over the phone, Dr. Worse spoke vehemently against me defending myself against powerful systems and suggested I remember what happened to Sandra Bland. Red flag, red flag. You see, I was defending myself to Dr. Worse against a student-made accusation, specifically about the completion of an assignment. Nothing about the situation warranted her comparing me to Sandra Bland. This passive-aggressive death threat was the primary statement that made me 100% certain that Dr. Worse was the primary agent of chaos solicited by the supervisory regime, so I began my research. I would sit and ask for extra details on her stories of student and adult stakeholders mobbing black employees. It didn't matter if the person was young, old, PhD, EDD, male, female, or a new or experienced employee. According to Dr. Worse, if the employee was black, they were automatically a target of ongoing microaggressions, plagiarism of ideas, insults, bullying, and ridicule. Dr. Worse even suggested that I reach out to and collaborate with other black female colleagues who would corroborate her claims of racism running rampant in the organization. One of the most prominent statements made by Dr. Worse was that she witnessed the organization execute some of the most diabolical practices against employees, and that most of the attacks I experienced were via Miss Minnie, who Dr. Evil trained on how to attack employees. I knew Dr. Worst was referencing the monitoring, snooping, manipulation of emails, and giving written scripts to student stakeholders to attack me verbally via Zoom. I had already induced that reality by analyzing the information I had collected thus far. I also knew Dr. Worst was the most deceptive because she pretended to exist as an ally rather than the primary agent of hate and destruction. For example, in my meetings with Dr. Evil and Miss Minnie, I always ensured my questions sought understanding from a policy based perspective. Despite their role in the mobbing process, in most meetings and encounters, the duo sought to clarify my confusion and teach organizational norms that seemed more autocratic than racist. Additionally, during my encounters with the mentor and mentee, I realized that my mistakes were instructions Dr. Worst suggested and cleared. Dr. Worst purposely gave me incorrect directives that took hours to complete. In one meeting with Miss Evil and Miss Minnie, we discussed my errors in completing a task, and I remember saying, "But I asked," without saying who I asked. And I remember Miss Evil looking straight into my eyes over Zoom and saying, "Cassandra, whoever you think is helping you is not helping you." We both knew who she was talking about, and that's when I realized Miss Evil served as the proper department head. What was even more interesting was Dr. Worst telling me not to discuss our conversations with Miss Evil and Miss Minnie because they would never discuss someone of their race and ethnicity with me. However, Mrs. Evil made it very well clear that Dr. Worst shared our conversations. And then there was Mr. Impulse. Up next, we will continue with Cycle 1, Stage 1 of the Appreciative Inform, the Resonant Transformation, by continuing to disclose my traumatic narrative as it relates to governance goal engagement. Part 4, Personnel Management of Mobbing, Part 3. See you there.